Hello, grade 12s. In this lesson, I will be addressing topic 9, that is economic growth and development, specifically on South Africa's economy. Okay, these two concepts are closely linked, and I want to emphasize that it is important to know that they do not mean the same thing. Hence, it is important to differentiate between the two. So let us first look at economic growth. What is economic growth? What are we talking about when we are saying the economy has increased or when we are saying the economy has decreased? Okay, so we are looking at an increase in the production capacity of a country over a specific period of time, usually a year. When we are looking at economic growth, for example, we are looking how many goods were produced this year compared to last year. If there were more goods produced this year, then we can certainly say that the economy has grown. There's been an increase in the production capacity. And then there is economic development. What is economic development? When we are talking about economic development, we are referring to an increase in the standard of living of people in a country over a specific period of time. Okay, so in order for economic development to happen, there must be economic growth. There must be an increase in economic growth in that particular country. What do I mean by this? Let me give you an example. We said economic growth relates to an increase in the production capacity. For example, we were producing 50 billion goods and services in 2019. Now, 2020, we are producing 80 billion goods and services. The increase there is showing economic growth, but then it will result in economic development. How so? That increase will mean that people were required to produce those goods and services, and it will mean that people were employed. So when a person is employed, they receive some source of income, and that income will improve their standard of living. These people will now be able to provide for their basic needs and wants. That is why we are saying there must be an increase in the production capacity of a country in order for people's standard of living to improve. Okay, so how then do we measure? How do we measure this economic growth? We measure economic growth using real GDP. We will look at real GDP in broad as we move through the slides, and then we measure economic development. How can you measure an improvement in someone's standard of living? Economists developed an index, which is a tool for measuring economic development, and it is called the Human Development Index, known as HDI. So economic development is measured using the HDI, while economic growth is measured using real GDP. Here I want to emphasize and state that there is nominal GDP and real GDP. The reason we are using real GDP is because real GDP takes into consideration inflation. It considers the fact that prices fluctuate during the year, whereas nominal GDP does not take into consideration inflation. So it is important to measure economic growth, considering that something that was costing 15 rand in January might not be costing 15 rand in August. So we consider that change. Hence, we measure it in the real GDP. And then economic growth focuses on goods and services. Economic development simply focuses on people's standard of living. And then it is a necessary input for economic development, this economic growth. As economic development results from economic growth. The economy must grow in order for people's standard of living to increase. How does economic growth relate with economic development? How are these two concepts related? Okay, when an economy is growing, there are certain things that will occur. When an economy is growing, it tells you that more jobs were created, meaning people are receiving an income, and when people receive an income, their standard of living improves. So you need economic growth for economic development to take place. However, economic growth does not guarantee economic development. Are we together there? Economic growth does not guarantee economic development, but in order for economic development to occur, the economy must have growth. There must be economic growth. What is real GDP? I gave a difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. When we are looking at GDP, we look at different participants in the economy in terms of their spending. And the formula for calculating real GDP, it is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, whereby the C represents consumption spending. How much are households spending on goods and services? That will help us to determine economic growth, because we want to see how much goods were produced. And then investment spending, how much is being invested? Businesses are investing in production techniques, machinery, and all those. That also helps in determining production in the country. And then government spending. How much is government spending on the provision of goods and services? Then exports and imports. It is important to always minus imports from exports. And if we find a positive figure, it means that we are exporting more than what we are importing. It shows an increase in our production capacity. And we take them in their change. Therefore, a change in GDP is equals to a change in consumption spending plus a change in investment spending plus government spending plus change in exports minus imports. The change there accounts for that inflation that I was talking about. It is showing that there was a change in prices, hence the name real GDP. So that is how we calculate economic growth. We are taking into consideration consumers, we are taking into consideration businesses, we are also taking into consideration the government and how much we export and import. And then we said in order to measure economic development, we use a tool called the Human Development Index. This Human Development Index, how do we measure it? What are the factors that we are supposed to consider to end up saying that this is the country's HDI? Okay, it is used to measure a country's economic development, and it is measured using the following factors. Life expectancy. When we are talking about life expectancy, we are talking about the rate at which you are expected to live from the time you are born. So countries have different life expectancies, and life expectancy is driven by a lot of factors, health being one of them. So if a country's health state is good, it means that their life expectancy will also be high. So we look at the life expectancy, and we also look at the literacy level. If a person is literate, we are meaning that that person is able to read and write. So they are most likely going to be able to improve their standard of living. The same way with education. If someone acquires some certain level of education, they are employable. They can enter into the work environment with their education level, therefore leaving them room to receive income, which will help in improving their standard of living. Those are the other